1940, Nevada. Two archaeologists pull a bundle out of the darkness of a cave, expecting to find just another lost artifact. Instead, they find America's oldest natural mummy, older even than Ötzi. For decades, his true age and ancestry sparked a fierce debate, tribal outcry, and a genuine scientific mystery. When DNA from a single bone finally spoke, it didn't just rewrite how the continent was peopled, it revealed a lost connection stretching across 10,000 years that almost nobody thought possible. How did one forgotten mummy end up forcing history to change its story? This is really a story in 3 separate acts, and each one belongs to a completely different era of discovery. First came the physical find itself, back in 1940, made with nothing more than a lantern and careful hands. Then came the science of dating, arriving decades later and completely upending what anyone thought they knew. And finally came the genetics, which didn't just answer an old scientific question, but resolved a genuine human conflict that had been simmering for years. Understanding all 3 acts together is really the only way to understand why this particular mummy still matters so much today. What the Wheelers found in the dark Sydney and Georgia Wheeler moved carefully through the gloom of Spirit Cave, their lantern light catching on bundles tucked into the dry earth. They were expecting animal bones or broken tools, maybe another fragment of the region's prehistoric story. Instead, they found something far rarer, the tightly wrapped form of a human being preserved by the cave's cool, arid air. They unwrapped layers of tool matting, each strand woven in an intricate diamond pattern, and uncovered the partial remains of a man. His head and right shoulder were still cloaked in leathery skin and tufts of dark hair, untouched for thousands of years. The hair, straight and coarse, turned a reddish brown almost instantly once exposed to the light. A silent reaction to the world outside after millennia spent in shadow. He had been laid on his side, knees drawn up, cradled in a blanket made from rabbit skins. The blanket itself was a marvel, sewn with real care and skill, its seams nearly invisible. Around his feet, the Wheelers found moccasins, split-toed, crafted from 2 different kinds of animal fur, their soles tough but flexible. The footwear spoke of a people who understood both the land and the demands of long travel. Nearby, more than 60 other objects lay scattered, awls, bone tools, and fragments of basketry. Each one was cataloged and boxed for the journey to the Nevada State Museum in Carson City. The Wheelers weren't casual treasure hunters passing through the area. They were part of a broader Civil Works Administration project during the Great Depression, tasked with systematically surveying caves across the Nevada desert for exactly this kind of archaeological material. Spirit Cave itself sits in the Grimes Point area east of Fallon, a stretch of desert dotted with dozens of similar rock shelters and caves, many of which had already yielded scattered tools and fragments over the years. Nothing about the setting suggested this particular cave would turn out to be different from the others nearby. That's part of what made the discovery so genuinely startling in the moment. The Wheelers had spent days working through unremarkable sediment before the lantern light finally caught on something that clearly wasn't just another broken tool. That Depression-era survey work, largely forgotten today outside of specialist circles, quietly laid the groundwork for decades of Great Basin archaeology that followed. Government-funded relief programs during the 1930s put trained surveyors and eager volunteers into remote desert terrain that private researchers rarely had the funding to reach on their own. Many of the region's most significant early finds, Spirit Cave included, trace back to this same brief window of federally sponsored fieldwork, a reminder that major discoveries often depend as much on who happens to be looking and when, as they do on what's actually buried in the ground waiting to be found. Signs of a hard life and a careful burial. As they examined the skeleton, the Wheelers noted a healed fracture on the skull, evidence of a serious injury the man had survived long before death. The teeth told a harsher story. Severe abscesses had hollowed the jaw, leaving behind signs of pain that must have haunted the man's final years. Yet the overall care in his burial suggested respect, even reverence. Every artifact, every layer of matting, every fold of the rabbit skin blanket hinted at a culture with deep traditions and refined craft. Later forensic analysis, conducted decades after the initial excavation, would add further detail to this picture. Researchers examining the skeletal remains more closely identified signs consistent with a physically demanding life, where patterns on the joints and spine, typical of someone who spent years walking long distances across uneven desert and marsh terrain, carrying loads and performing the repetitive physical labor involved in hunting, gathering, and craft production. None of that would have been unusual for the period. But, combined with the healed skull fracture and the dental abscesses, it paints a picture of a man who endured real physical hardship across his lifetime, and whose community nonetheless took the time and care to bury him with genuine ceremony, rather than simply leaving him where he fell. The Wheelers recorded each detail in their field notes, measuring, sketching, and labeling everything they found. They estimated the remains to be around 1,500 to 2,000 years old, based purely on the style of the textiles and tools, Without radiocarbon dating, there was simply no way to know just how far back in time this burial actually reached. The artifacts and the body, carefully packed and transported, would spend decades sitting in museum storage, their secrets waiting for new science to unlock them. In the moment, though, what stood out was the tangible reality of a life lived in a world both familiar and utterly lost. A man wrapped in skillfully woven mats, protected by the work of hands that understood the land, and laid to rest with the quiet dignity of his people. A vanished inland sea. 10,000 years ago, the land beyond Spirit Cave looked nothing like the sun-bleached valleys that stretch across Nevada today. Instead of barren dust and salt flats, a vast inland sea shimmered under the sky. Lake Lahontan covered nearly 21,000 square kilometers. This pluvial lake was one of the largest bodies of fresh water in North America, rivaled only by the great glacial lakes far to the north. Its waters filled basins fed by rivers that still bear their ancient names today: the Walker, the Carson, the Truckee, and the Humboldt. Along these riverbanks, lush wetlands spread for miles. Marsh grasses waved in the wind, and tule reeds grew thick, creating a living patchwork of green. Flocks of waterfowl darkened the horizon each spring and fall, their migrations marking the passing seasons. Fish thrived in the shallows, while herds of antelope and bands of bighorn sheep grazed the surrounding uplands. The people who called this place home relied heavily on these resources, shaping their lives around the cycles of water and movement. Tule, the reed lining the lake's edges, became the raw material for baskets, mats, and shelter. The skill woven into every artifact found in Spirit Cave speaks of a culture deeply tuned to the rhythms of this watery world. Archaeologists studying this broader region have found evidence of that same tool-based technology repeated across dozens of other sites scattered around the ancient Lahontan Basin, suggesting a shared toolkit and shared knowledge passed down across many generations of families living along these shores. The diamond weave pattern found in the Spirit Caveman's burial mats wasn't a one-off flourish. It reflects a broader tradition of basketry and textile work that spread throughout the wetlands surrounding the lake, adapted by different communities to their own local materials and needs, but recognizably part of the same underlying cultural inheritance. A landscape that preserved its own story, but the land was changing. As the last ice age faded, the climate grew warmer and drier. Lake Lahontan began to shrink, its shoreline retreating year by year. What had been a single sprawling expanse of water slowly broke apart into isolated lakes and marshes. Pyramid Lake and Walker Lake are all that remain of that ancient system today, their blue surfaces a faint echo of what once was. The valleys, once green and teeming with life, hardened into the arid basins that define the Great Basin as we know it now. This transformation reshaped everything. Where there had once been abundance, survival now demanded constant adaptation. The people who lived near Spirit Cave watched as the wetlands receded and the reeds grew scarce. But the very process that forced them to change also ended up preserving their story. As the air grew drier and the soil more alkaline, the cave's cool darkness became a natural vault. The remains and artifacts left behind, the woven mats, the moccasins, the small fragments of daily life, were spared the decay that claimed so much of the surrounding ancient world. The land that once sustained a thriving community became, quite unintentionally, the keeper of its memory. The mummy wrapped in tule and rabbit skins survived not just through human care, but through the slow, patient work of climate and time. In the silence of Spirit Cave, the past endured, waiting for the day when science would finally catch up to the secrets locked inside bone and fiber. Decades in a museum drawer. For more than half a century, the Spirit Cave mummy remained little more than a museum curiosity, cataloged and boxed away among the Nevada State Museum's broader collections. The Wheelers' field notes, careful as they were, could only ever offer educated guesses about the true age of the remains. In the 1940s, archaeologists relied entirely on comparisons, styles of weaving, shapes of tools, the general look and feel of a burial. Without radiocarbon dating, there was simply no way to know whether the man from Spirit Cave belonged to the distant past or to a much more recent chapter of Nevada's history. So for 54 years, the mummy and his artifacts quietly gathered dust, their secrets locked away by the limits of the science available at the time. A new kind of technology arrives. Everything changed in the mid-1990s, when a new kind of technology arrived in the world of archaeology, accelerator mass spectrometry, or AMS. This method could measure the faintest traces of radioactive carbon left behind in ancient bone, hair, or textiles. Unlike earlier radiocarbon methods, AMS needed only a tiny sample, a sliver of matting, a wisp of hair, or a small scrap of bone. The process began with careful cleaning to remove any modern contamination. Then the sample was combusted inside a sealed chamber, turning it into carbon dioxide gas. The gas was then converted into graphite, a pure form of carbon, and loaded into the accelerator itself. Inside the AMS machine, ions were propelled at extremely high speeds, and the ratio of carbon-14 to carbon-12 was counted with incredible precision. Every step of the process was designed to squeeze as much information as possible out of the smallest possible trace of material. In 1996, R.E. Taylor at the University of California, Riverside, brought the Spirit Cave materials into this new era. 17 samples, including pieces of tool matting and human hair, were submitted for AMS dating. The work was meticulous. Each sample was tracked from museum drawer to lab bench, every single step documented carefully to avoid any possible error. Taylor's team followed the combustion to graphite protocol exactly, ensuring the eventual results would stand up to serious scrutiny. It's worth appreciating just how significant a shift this technology represented for archaeology as a whole, not just for Spirit Cave specifically. Older radiocarbon methods from earlier decades had needed comparatively large samples, often destroying a meaningful portion of a fragile artifact just to get a usable reading. That kind of destructive testing made museums and researchers understandably cautious about submitting rare or culturally significant items for dating in the first place. AMS changed that calculation almost overnight. Suddenly, a single hair or a fragment of woven material smaller than a fingernail could yield a reliable date, opening the door to testing thousands of previously untouched artifacts sitting quietly in storage collections around the world, Spirit Cave's materials among them. This same shift played out across museum collections worldwide throughout the 1990s, as curators and researchers went back through decades of previously undated material with fresh eyes. Items that had been cataloged for generations based purely on stylistic guesswork suddenly had real, measurable ages attached to them for the first time. Some turned out to be roughly as old as originally estimated. Others, like Spirit Cave, turned out to be dramatically older, forcing a wholesale reassessment of collections that had sat largely unquestioned for decades. In that sense, Spirit Cave wasn't an isolated fluke of good timing. It was one particularly dramatic example of a much broader wave of rediscovery sweeping through archaeology during that exact period, as accelerator mass spectrometry finally let scientists ask precise questions of objects that had previously only offered vague stylistic answers. The anticipation in the lab was quiet but genuinely intense. For decades, the true age of the Spirit Caveman had been little more than a matter of speculation. Now, for the first time, the evidence itself would finally speak, free from guesswork and inherited assumption. The outcome would end up not only rewriting the story of one single burial, but challenging everything archaeologists thought they already knew about the earliest people to settle North America. That 54-year delay between discovery and dating wasn't just a matter of lost time. It stands as a genuine reminder of how quickly science can change both the questions we're able to ask and the answers we're actually able to hear. The Spirit Cave mummy, once treated as little more than a local relic, was about to become a genuine key to understanding the deep human past of an entire continent. A number that landed like a jolt. The numbers coming out of the accelerator mass spectrometry lab arrived with a genuine jolt. The Spirit Caveman wasn't just old, he was ancient beyond any previous North American find. The radiocarbon dates pointed to an age of roughly 9,400 years before present. Once calibrated, that meant the man buried in tool mats and rabbit skins had actually lived more than 10,600 years ago. For comparison, Europe's most famous natural mummy, Ötzi, the Iceman, had lain preserved in the Alps for just over 5,000 years. The Spirit Caveman was twice as old. His story reached all the way back to a time when mammoths still wandered the continent's northern fringes, a discovery that rippled outward. The news rippled outward quickly from the Nevada State Museum and the University of California, Riverside, where R.E. Taylor's team had completed the dating work. In 1997, Kitty Kuhn and colleagues published the findings in a peer-reviewed journal, and the wider archaeological world quickly took notice. Headlines in science magazines and major newspapers declared the Spirit Cave mummy the oldest natural mummy ever found in North America. The discovery wasn't just about setting a new record. It called into question nearly everything researchers thought they knew about the very first people to settle the continent. The old methods of comparing basket patterns, tool shapes, or burial styles suddenly seemed genuinely limited. Hard data now showed that people had been living, dying, and creating complex, sophisticated cultures in the Great Basin thousands of years earlier than anyone had previously dared to guess. In academic circles, the reaction was swift and at times genuinely contentious. Some scholars welcomed the new timeline, eager to re-examine old assumptions about migration and settlement across the continent. Others hesitated, wondering whether a single extraordinary date could really be enough to upend decades of careful, established theorizing. Internationally, Spirit Cave was compared to some of the greatest archaeological discoveries of the previous century. The mummy's age meant that North America's human story was far older and considerably more complex than the familiar, tidy narratives built around Clovis points and simple Ice Age hunters. The Spirit Caveman, wrapped in his woven mats, became a genuine symbol for a past that was suddenly deeper and more mysterious than anyone had previously imagined. The comparison to Ötzi, the Iceman, discovered in the Alps in 1991, proved especially useful for public understanding, since Ötzi had already become a household name by the mid-1990s, complete with museum exhibitions, documentaries, and detailed forensic reconstructions of his final days. Journalists covering the Spirit Cave results leaned heavily on that comparison to help readers grasp the scale of what had just been confirmed. If Ötzi, already famous for being ancient, represented roughly 5,000 years of preservation, then a mummy sitting quietly in a Nevada museum drawer for over half a century, representing more than twice that span of time, deserved every bit as much attention. That framing helped turn a fairly technical radiocarbon dating result into a story that spread well beyond academic journals and into mainstream newspapers and television coverage across the country. A question that went beyond science. This revelation also raised genuinely uncomfortable questions. If people were living in Nevada 10,600 years ago, who exactly were their descendants? What had happened to their traditions, their languages, their stories over all that time? With the world's attention now on Spirit Cave, the question of cultural ownership took on real, urgent significance. Tribes in the region, especially the Falan Paiute Shoshone, saw the mummy not as some abstract scientific specimen, but as a genuine ancestor. The old bones, once quietly forgotten in museum storage, had become the center of a much larger struggle over identity, memory, and the basic right to decide how the past should be honored. The shock of the dating results did more than simply rewrite old timelines. It set the stage for a debate that would stretch on for decades, drawing in scientists, lawmakers, and indigenous communities alike, all searching for answers in the silence of that cave. A legal fight over ancestry. In March 1997, the Falan Paiute Shoshone tribe filed a formal petition under the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. Their claim was direct and unwavering. The man unearthed from Spirit Cave was their ancestor, and his remains belonged with his people. The Bureau of Land Management, responsible for federal land and its archaeological resources, reviewed the petition and denied it. Their argument rested heavily on the shape of the skull. Craniometric measurements, they argued, suggested that the Spirit Cave man didn't closely resemble modern Native American populations. That position aligned with what's known as the Paleo-American hypothesis, a theory claiming the earliest peoples of the Americas might have belonged to a distinct, unrelated population group entirely. For the tribe, the Bureau of Land Management's decision was more than just a bureaucratic ruling. It felt like a direct rejection of their own history and of their right to define their own past on their own terms. The case eventually moved to federal court. Lawyers for the Falan Paiute Shoshone argued that the government's heavy reliance on skull measurements alone ignored the real weight of oral tradition and the evidence of genuine cultural continuity. Years of legal filings and expert testimony followed, as anthropologists publicly debated the validity of using bone shapes alone to determine ancestry. In 2006, after nearly a decade of legal wrangling, the United States District Court finally issued a ruling. The judge found that the Bureau of Land Management had acted arbitrarily and capriciously by dismissing tribal evidence and relying solely on skeletal morphology. The court ordered the agency to reconsider the tribe's claim. But even then, the case remained in limbo. Without definitive genetic proof one way or another, the government and the tribe remained genuinely at an impasse. The remains stayed in storage, the legal battle unresolved, and the underlying question of ancestry simply hung in the air, a conflict shaped entirely by uncertainty, waiting for science to finally offer some kind of definitive answer. This entire episode also unfolded against a much larger, tenser national backdrop. Around the same period, the discovery and legal fight over another set of ancient remains, known as Kennewick Man in Washington state, was dominating headlines and setting early legal precedent for exactly this kind of dispute. Scientists in that case had also pointed to skull shape as evidence against Native American ancestry, and tribes there had also pushed back hard, arguing that cranial measurements were a deeply flawed way to determine who counted as an ancestor. The eventual DNA results in the Kennewick Man case, confirming Native American ancestry after all, became an important reference point for advocates fighting the Spirit Cave case as well, since it demonstrated that skeletal morphology alone had genuinely misled researchers before and could easily be doing so again. Building trust before touching a bone. S.K. Willerslev arrived in Falan carrying more than just scientific ambition. He brought a genuine promise. No DNA would be touched without the tribe's explicit blessing, and if the results proved native ancestry, the remains would go home for good. Earning that trust took real time. He made 3 separate visits, held long, honest conversations, and welcomed tribal members directly into the Copenhagen laboratory when the petrous bone was eventually sampled. Only after the Falan Paiute Shoshone gave their explicit consent in October 2015 did the actual scientific work begin. The petrous bone, dense and well-shielded deep within the skull, offered the best possible chance of preserving genuine ancient genetic material. Willerslev's team extracted DNA with truly painstaking care, every single step overseen and carefully documented along the way. What the DNA finally revealed. The findings, published in the journal Science on November 8, 2018, delivered real clarity where years of legal argument and anatomical measurement alike had ultimately failed. The spirit caveman's Y chromosome belonged to haplogroup QMA48, and his mitochondrial DNA belonged to haplogroup D1. Both lineages are unmistakably Native American, and both are still found among tribal descendants living across the Americas today. The genetic evidence was irrefutable. The man wrapped in tool mats and rabbit skins was not some unrelated stranger. He was a direct ancestor of the very people who had spent decades fighting for his return. The specific method Willerslev's team used deserves a little more explanation, because it explains why the results carried so much scientific weight. Petrous bone, the dense portion of the skull surrounding the inner ear, has become something of a gold standard in ancient DNA research over the past decade, precisely because its unusual density protects genetic material far better than almost any other bone in the body. Where earlier attempts at extracting usable DNA from ancient remains often failed outright, or produced results too degraded and contaminated to trust, petrous bone sampling has repeatedly succeeded where other methods came up empty. That's exactly what happened here. Despite more than 7 decades in museum storage, exposed to handling, temperature changes, and the ordinary wear of institutional life, the spirit caveman's petrous bone still held enough intact genetic material for Willerslev's team to sequence a usable genome. The study went even further, revealing a genetic connection stretching all the way from Nevada down to Brazil. The spirit caveman and the roughly 10,400-year-old Lagoa Santa remains found in Brazil shared such close underlying ancestry that their shared ancestral population must have crossed more than 6,000 miles of unfamiliar continent in less than 200 years. Archaeologist David Meltzer called it breathtaking speed, a genuine testament to the adaptability and skill of the very first Americans. And yet, the DNA also revealed something notably missing. An Australasian genetic signal found in some other ancient South American remains did not appear anywhere in the spirit caveman's genome, hinting at additional lost migrations and mysteries that still remain entirely unsolved today. That missing signal is worth sitting with for a moment because it complicates the otherwise clean, satisfying story this discovery seems to tell. If a single wave of ancestors could carry shared DNA from Nevada all the way to Brazil within a couple of centuries, then whatever separate population carried that faint Australasian genetic echo into South America must have arrived through some other route, or at some other time, entirely disconnected from the story preserved inside the spirit caveman's own bones. Researchers still don't agree on exactly how or when that separate signal made its way into the Americas. Some have proposed a distinct, largely vanished population arriving via a different coastal route. Others suggest a more complex pattern of multiple small founding groups mixing unevenly across different regions over time. Spirit Cave didn't resolve that particular mystery. If anything, it sharpened it by proving definitively that at least one major population did move quickly and directly, while leaving the question of that other, stranger signal entirely open for future research to untangle. A homecoming long foretold. On November 22, 2016, the remains were officially repatriated to the Fallon Paiute Shoshone tribe. Science had finally answered the question that decades of legal argument couldn't resolve on its own. But for the tribe, it was really a homecoming that had already been foretold by their own tradition, long before any lab ever confirmed it. The man from Spirit Cave was returned to his people, to his story, and to his land. Ancient DNA now does something centuries of debate alone never managed to accomplish. It links living communities directly to their ancestors across 10,000 years of American history. As science continues rewriting the past, tribal voices are reclaiming their own story right alongside it, and the boundaries of identity keep shifting in real time. The question is no longer really about who belongs to this land, it's about whether the rest of us are finally ready to listen to those who always have. What Spirit Cave changed. Going forward, the resolution of the Spirit Cave case rippled outward well beyond Nevada. It helped shift how museums, federal agencies, and researchers across the country approach ancient remains connected to living tribal communities. Genetic testing, once treated as a last resort or an academic curiosity, increasingly became a standard first step in repatriation cases, precisely because it had proven itself capable of resolving disputes that decades of skeletal analysis and legal argument alone simply couldn't settle. That shift came with its own complications, too. Not every ancient burial has DNA well preserved enough to test, and not every tribe wants genetic testing performed on ancestral remains in the first place, for reasons rooted in their own cultural and spiritual traditions. Willerslev's approach at Spirit Cave, built on years of trust building and explicit consent before a single sample was taken, became something of a model for how that kind of sensitive work could be done respectfully going forward, rather than simply imposed from the outside by scientists eager for a publishable result. The man from Spirit Cave spent 76 years away from his people, first in a museum drawer, then at the center of a legal fight that outlasted an entire human lifetime. His return in 2016 didn't erase that long separation, but it did finally close a chapter that had opened the moment the Wheelers first lifted him out of the dark, and it left behind a genuine blueprint for how science and tribal communities might work together the next time the ground gives up a secret this old. For the Fallon Paiute Shoshone, the reburial in November 2016 was reportedly conducted according to their own traditional practices, away from public cameras and academic fanfare. A quiet ending deliberately chosen to contrast with the decades of very public argument that had preceded it. Tribal members who had spent years attending court hearings and reviewing scientific reports finally got to lay their ancestor to rest on their own terms, on their own land, according to their own customs. That contrast between the noisy, contested science and the quiet, private ceremony that followed says something important about what this whole story was actually about in the end. The DNA results made headlines. The reburial deliberately did not. And that difference in visibility was entirely the point. Looking back across the full arc of this story, from a lantern-lit cave in 1940 to a courtroom battle spanning nearly a decade, to a genetics lab in Copenhagen built on years of carefully earned trust, it's worth remembering that every step forward depended on people willing to sit with genuine uncertainty rather than rush toward a convenient answer. The Bureau of Land Management could have simply accepted tribal testimony from the start. Researchers could have skipped the DNA testing and left the old skull measurements standing unchallenged. Willerslev could have pushed forward with sampling years earlier without waiting for explicit consent. None of that happened, and the story took longer to resolve because of it. But the resolution that did eventually arrive carried a weight and legitimacy that a faster, less careful process never could have produced. Sometimes the right answer really does require decades of patience on every side of the argument,